I rode for Holt Sayer for 11 years before the winter he lost everything, and I can tell you this much. The man I watched walk up to Clara Voss's porch that December was not the same man who'd once made a railroad surveyor cry in front of his own crew. He was still wearing the coat, the good one, the charcoal wool that had seen him through 24 cattle deals and 1 federal hearing. But the coat was wrong on him now. Too big somehow, like a borrowed thing, like a man wearing the shape of who he used to be. I rode behind him at a respectful distance. That was my habit with Holt Sayer. You learned, if you worked for him long enough, that the man needed room around him the way a fire needs air. Crowd him and he'd go cold on you. Give him space, and he'd eventually say what needed saying. He hadn't said much in 3 weeks. The Meridian Land Syndicate had moved fast, the way syndicates always do when they've been patient long enough. Holt had borrowed against his cattle operation to expand west a 2nd range, a 3rd water right, a bunkhouse up near the Laramie line, and when beef prices dropped 2 seasons running and the bank called the notes in, Meridian was standing at the door with the paperwork already drawn. 9,000 acres, the house, the equipment, 43 head of registered stock he'd built from nothing. Gone in a morning's worth of legal documents, and Holt had stood in the yard and watched it happen with his hat in his hands and his jaw set like iron, and not said a single word that a man could repeat in decent company, nor one that couldn't be repeated either. He hadn't said a word at all. That was 3 weeks before December. We'd been staying at the Anchor Hotel in Crofton, which was no place for a man of Holt Sayer's former standing and was no place for a man of his current standing either. And when the money for the room ran thin, he'd come to me at breakfast one morning and set a folded piece of paper on the table between us. "Clara Voss," he said. I looked at the paper. It had a hand-drawn map on it, which was typical of how things got communicated out in the Wyoming high country in 1879. You drew it or you described it and hoped the other person had a reasonable sense of direction. Who's Clara Voss? Widow, runs a station out past the Bitterroot Fork, had a freight operation, mostly dried up now. She's got 400 acres of decent grass and a deed that's clean and a problem I heard about from Kettner at the feed store. He paused. She's about to lose the water right on the east draw. Some fellow named Pog filed on it in October, says it lapsed when her husband died. It hasn't lapsed, she's been working it, but she doesn't have a man's signature on the renewal paperwork, and the county clerk is one of Pog's hunting partners. I looked at him. "So you're going out there?" "I'm going out there. To help a widow." Holt Sayer gave me the look he reserved for questions that weren't worth answering. It wasn't unkind. It just had a ceiling on it. "I'm going out there because she has grass and shelter and a deed problem that happens to intersect with a problem I have, which is that I no longer have grass or shelter or a deed. If I put my name on her renewal paperwork, it's a man's signature, and Pog's arrangement with the clerk becomes a good deal less comfortable. She gets her water right. I get a roof in time." He folded the paper. "It's a transaction, Deke. And if she doesn't want the transaction..." He picked up his coffee. "Then I'll sleep in the barn." I don't know what I expected Clara Voss to look like. I suppose I'd built up some picture in my mind, a fragile woman maybe, the kind who'd be grateful and overwhelmed and easy to read. That's the kind of thinking that 11 years with Holt Sayer hadn't entirely cured me of. What I got instead was a woman who came to the door of her ranch house with a ledger book under one arm and a look on her face that suggested she'd already done the math on us before we'd finished tying our horses. She was perhaps 38, 39. Brown hair pinned back with the no-nonsense efficiency of someone who didn't have time to think about how her hair was pinned. She wore a canvas apron over a gray wool dress, and her boots were practical, and her hands, I noticed, had ink on 2 fingers, which meant she'd been working the books when we knocked. She looked at Holt, then at me, then back at Holt. "You're Sayer," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am. I heard about the Meridian business. Her voice was flat, not unkind, but carrying no particular sympathy either, just information filed and noted. "Come in then, wipe your boots." That was it, no fuss, no ceremony. We wiped our boots and went in. The inside of the Voss station house was clean and spare. A cast-iron stove in the kitchen corner, a long work table with the ledger she'd been carrying now set back open to the page she'd left off, a shelf of provisions above the dry sink, a second shelf with a Bible, and 3 other books whose spines I couldn't read from where I stood. The kind of place that had been made comfortable through a steady application of practical effort rather than any particular softness. She poured coffee without asking if we wanted it, another thing I noted, and set it on the table and sat down across from us with her hands folded and waited. Holt laid it out plainly. He had a talent for that, for reducing complicated arrangements to their essential bones without making them sound cold. He told her about Pog and the water filing. He told her he'd looked at the county records in Crofton, and that her claim was solid, but that the clerk, one Aldous Merritt, had a long history of finding creative interpretations of lapsed claims when the right man asked him to. He told her that his name on the renewal, as a principal party with an established interest in the station, would give Merritt's creativity a good deal less room to operate. And in return, she said, room and board through the winter, the use of the barn for my horse and Deeks, whatever work I can do to earn it. She looked at him for a long moment, not warily exactly, more the way you'd look at a column of figures you weren't sure added up right. "What kind of work?" "Whatever needs doing. I've run cattle operations for 20 years. I can fix fence, rent a market, negotiate a freight contract, doctor a horse, or run a branding crew. I'm not proud." Something in her expression shifted just slightly. "That last part," she said, "is that true?" Holt looked at her. "Which last part?" "That you're not proud." A pause. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind was picking up off the high ground, the kind of wind that carried ice in it this time of year. "No," Holt said, and there was something in his voice I hadn't heard from him in weeks, something almost like a man standing on solid ground again, even if it was someone else's ground. "That last part isn't true. I'm considerably proud, but I'm not so proud that I'd sleep in the cold to keep it." Clara Voss looked at him for another moment. Then something very brief and very contained happened at the corner of her mouth. "All right," she said. "The back room is yours, Mr. Sayer. Deke can have the bunk room off the barn. It's small, but it's warm." She pulled the ledger toward her. "Supper's at 6. I cook enough for 3 and no more, so don't be late." That was how it started, not with gratitude, not with sentiment, with a ledger pulled back to the working page and a supper time stated plainly. I thought, this woman is going to be interesting. I was right about that. The first week, Holt and Clara Voss were like 2 pieces of furniture in a room that hadn't quite figured out how to be arranged. Polite, functional, occupying their respective spaces without collision. Holt was up before dawn every morning and he worked, which is the only thing I ever saw Holt Sayer do when he didn't know what else to do. He split wood. He patched the section of fence on the east draw that had been leaning since September. He found 3 places where the barn roof was letting weather in, and he fixed them with boards and tar paper and more patience than the job probably required. Clara watched all of this from a careful distance, not suspicious, exactly, more like a woman who'd learned to wait and see before she committed to an opinion. She ran the station with a system I came to admire. Every morning she was at the books, her late husband's freight records, the current expenses, what was owed and to whom and in what order. She had a mind for numbers the way some people have a mind for horses. She didn't have to think hard about it. It was just natural to her, and the things she saw in a column of figures would take another person twice as long and half the clarity. She'd been running the station alone for 2 years since her husband, Roy Voss, died of a fever in the spring of '77. 2 years of doing it all, the books, the stock, The negotiations with the freight company, the property taxes, the well maintenance, alone, without complaint, without asking anyone for a thing. I found this out not from her, but from a man named Gustafson who ran the feed store in the small town of Aldermere, 6 miles west, where I rode for supplies in that first week. Gustafson was a talker, and he had things to say about most people in the county, but what he said about Clara Voss he said with a particular kind of respect. She never asked for help, he said, loading flour into my saddlebag. Not once. Roy's brother came out after Roy died, offered to take the station off her hands at a fair price. She thanked him and showed him the door. Some fellow from the freight company came out, said they'd set her up with a smaller contract, easier to manage for a woman alone. She thanked him too and negotiated a bigger one. He shook his head. She's not a soft woman. No, I agreed. But she's a fair one, pays her bills on time, treats people square. He looked at me. What's Sayer after out there? A roof, I said. Same as anyone in winter. Gustafson didn't look entirely convinced, but he was a man who understood that some questions were asked for form's sake and weren't necessarily intended to receive a true answer. I rode back with the supplies and thought about what he'd said. A woman who wouldn't ask for help even when she needed it. That was one kind of pride, I thought. A different kind than Holt's, but recognizable. Two proud people in a house in the Wyoming high country, negotiating a transaction neither of them had a natural talent for. I found this privately rather entertaining. The water right business got handled in the second week. Holt rode to Crofton with Clara. She insisted on coming, which he didn't argue with, and they sat across from Aldous Merritt, the county clerk, who was a thin, careful man with the kind of eyes that were always doing arithmetic. Holt put the renewal paperwork on the desk with his name signed on the line marked principal interest holder, and he looked at Merritt with a look I recognized from the old days, the look that said, I know what you're doing and you know I know, and we're both going to behave as though this is a routine transaction. Merritt stamped the papers. It took 4 minutes. Clara Voss said thank you to Merritt in a voice that was perfectly civil and contained absolutely no warmth. As they walked out, I heard her say to Holt, very quietly, he was going to manufacture a problem. Yes, Holt said. And now he won't. Now he won't. She walked a few steps in silence. Thank you, she said. The same 2 words she'd said to Merritt, but different. Actually different. She didn't look at him when she said it, she was watching the street, but she said it like she meant it to land, and it did. Holt didn't say you're welcome. He just nodded once, the nod of a man who'd done what was right and didn't need to make anything more of it. That evening at supper, Clara put a piece of dried apple pie on the table that hadn't been there any other evening. She didn't say anything about it. She just put it there. Holt ate his piece without comment. But I noticed he ate it slowly, which was not how Holt Sayer typically ate anything. I had my piece too, and it was very good, and I kept my observations to myself. December settled in hard. The high country up near the Bitterroot Fork doesn't play at winter. It commits to it, full and serious, with winds that came off the peaks already carrying ice crystals and snows that could drop 3 feet in a single night, and drifts that closed the track to Aldermere for days at a time. We were, in the practical sense, snowbound more often than not. Which meant that the 3 of us, Holt, Clara, and me, were in each other's company for long stretches without the natural relief of being able to go somewhere else. I spent a good portion of my time in the barn. I told myself it was because the horses needed tending and the barn was where I could be useful. This was true, but it was also true that I had a powerful instinct to give Holt Sayer the room he needed, and the room he needed, increasingly, was the room inside that station house. I watched it from a distance. Not eavesdropping, I wasn't raised to that, but just watching the way 2 people move around each other when they're sharing close quarters and slowly, without discussing it, beginning to let their guards down by degrees. It started with the ledger. One evening in the second week of December, Holt came in from the barn after I'd already gone in, and he found Clara at the table with the freight accounts spread out, a crease between her brows that meant she'd found something that didn't add up the way it should. He poured himself coffee and stood at the edge of the table. "May I?" he said. She looked up, then at the ledger, then back up. A pause that was its own kind of calculation. Then she turned the book so he could see it. He sat down. For the next hour and a half, from what she told me later, she was not a woman who volunteered information, but occasionally, if you asked her a direct question at the right moment, she'd answer it honestly. They went through the freight rate structure that had been in place since Roy Voss's time and found two places where the contracted rates were substantially below the current market, which meant she'd been undercharging on the Aldermere run for 2 years and losing money she didn't have to lose. He looked at it the way I look at it, she told me, matter-of-factly, a week later, like it was a problem with a solution that was in there somewhere if you looked at it right. "And did you find the solution?" "We found it," she said. And then she went back to whatever she'd been doing and didn't say anything else about it. But that we had a weight to it, I noticed it. The thing about close quarters and long winters and two people who are both too proud to ask for things they need, what happens eventually is that they stop needing to ask. They just start doing. The transaction, the arrangement, the practical exchange of name on the deed for roof and board. It was still there, technically. The way the frame of a building is still there after you've finished the walls and the roof and filled the rooms with living. You could still find it if you went looking. But it wasn't the main thing anymore. The main thing, by the third week of December, was supper. Clara cooked enough for 3 and supper was at 6. She'd said that first day, and she'd meant it. But somewhere in the second and third weeks, the supper conversations had shifted from functional, past the salt. What's the weather going to do? The east fence needs a new corner post. To something that went longer and took unexpected turns and occasionally, not often but occasionally, included the sound of Holt Sayer saying something dry and precisely observed that made Clara Voss go quiet for a moment in a way that I eventually identified as the way a person goes quiet when they've just been surprised into finding something funny. She didn't laugh easily. That was a thing you had to understand about her. Roy Voss, by the accounts of those who'd known him, had been an easy man, easy to like, easy to talk to, quick with a story. Clara was the opposite of easy. She was exacting and self-contained, and she'd been alone for 2 years, and she'd built her solitude into something functional, the way she built everything into something functional, and she didn't give ground on it lightly. But Holt Sayer was not, as it turned out, the kind of man who asked for ground. He was the kind of man who simply occupied the space around him with enough steady, unremarkable presence that eventually you stopped noticing he was there and started noticing when he wasn't. I noticed this before Clara did, I think, or maybe I just noticed it sooner than she admitted it. There was an evening. This would have been the last week of December, a few days before the new year, with a hard snow sitting on the roof and the wind working at the window frames, when I came in from the barn to find them at the table. Not working. They had the freight ledger open between them, but neither of them was looking at it. They were talking. About something small, by the look of it. Their voices were low and easy, the way voices get when the conversation has been going long enough that it's found its own level. Clara had her coffee cup in both hands. Holt had his elbows on the table, which I'd never seen him do in any other setting in 11 years. I got my own coffee and went back to the barn. I wasn't avoiding anything. I just reckoned they didn't need an audience. The day before the new year, a man named Cord Pog rode up to the station. I want to say something about Cord Pog, because he matters to the story and because I find I don't want to say very much about him, which is a function of the fact that he was exactly the kind of man I have the least patience for. A man with enough money to make himself consequential and not enough character to make himself worth anything. He'd come to Wyoming 3 years prior with capital from somewhere back east. Nobody was quite sure where. And he'd set himself up as a land broker, which was a polite name for a man who found properties with technical vulnerabilities and applied pressure to those vulnerabilities until the owner sold cheap or lost the claim entirely. The water right on Clara's east draw had been one of his projects. The meridian filing on Holt's north range had been another, or at least Pog had been one of the names connected to it, which Holt had known and I had known, and which we hadn't yet found the right moment to bring up with Clara because we hadn't needed to. The water right was stamped and done. But Pog didn't know that yet when he rode up. He'd been out of the county for 6 weeks, and he was arriving expecting to find an isolated widow at the beginning of a bad winter with a water claim in jeopardy, and every reason to sell at a number that suited him. He came to the front door and knocked, and Clara opened it, and I was at the corner of the barn watching, and I could see on Pog's face the precise moment, when the calculation he'd been running for 6 weeks ran into a result he hadn't accounted for. That result was Holt Sayer, who appeared in the doorway behind Clara with his coffee cup, and the absolutely blank expression he used when he wanted a man to understand that he was being assessed and found wanting. Pog stood on the porch in the cold for a moment. "I was under the impression Mrs. Voss was managing this property alone," he said, finally. "People get the wrong impressions," Holt said. He said it pleasantly. There was a beat of silence. Clara, for her part, had her arms folded, and the expression of a woman who knew exactly what chord Pog had come for, and was waiting to see how he talked himself out of it. "I had some concerns about the water right filing," Pog said, "on the east draw." "It's been renewed," Clara said, "stamped and recorded December 15th. Pog's eyes moved to Holt and then back to Clara. "I see," he said. "Is there something else?" Clara said. There wasn't anything else. Pog was many things, but he wasn't stupid, and a stupid man would have pushed further. He said good day and rode back down the track to Aldermere. Clara closed the door. She stood for a moment with her hand still on the latch. "He was behind the meridian filing," she said. "It wasn't a question." "Partly," Holt said. She turned and looked at him. "You knew that when you came here?" "Yes." Another pause. The stove ticked. Outside, Pog's horse was a diminishing sound in the snow. "So this wasn't entirely a transaction," she said. Holt was quiet for a moment. "It was a transaction," he said. "I needed a roof. That was true. The rest of it, Pog, the connection to the Meridian business, that was information I had that I reckoned would be useful to you. Which it was." "Which it was," she repeated, not with irony but with the tone of a woman reviewing a set of figures that had just resolved themselves into a coherent total. She nodded once. "All right." She went back to the kitchen. After a moment, Holt followed. And after another moment, I heard the sounds of supper starting, the clunk of the cast iron, the scrape of the kettle. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of a house where people live. January came and brought with it the kind of cold that doesn't argue with you. It just sits down on the land like a stone and waits. The temperature in the barn before I got the second brazier going was enough to make a man's coffee freeze before he finished it, and the track to Aldermere was impassable for 16 days running. 16 days where the world shrank to the station house, the barn, the 100 feet of snowed-in yard between them, and the 3 of us. I want to be careful about how I tell this part because I am not a man given to romanticism, and I don't intend to start now. What I will say is this. When you are with 2 people through a long, hard winter, when you watch them work side by side in conditions that strip off every unnecessary thing a person carries, you learn what they're made of in a way that no other circumstance provides. What Clara Voss was made of, I already had a fair idea. She was made of the kind of discipline that doesn't look like discipline because it's so thoroughly become habit. She was made of precision and practicality, and a kind of warmth that was real, but that she gave out the way a person who's learned not to waste things gives out anything of value, carefully, and to good purpose. What Holt Sayer was made of, I'd known for 11 years or thought I had. He was made of iron and code, and the particular bone-deep stubbornness of a man who'd built something significant from very little and knew, therefore, exactly what things were worth. He was made of loyalty, which was a thing most people didn't know about him because he gave it quietly and to very few people and would have denied it if asked. But there was a third thing he was made of that I hadn't seen much of in the 11 years, and that I saw in that January, in that small kitchen, in that cold Wyoming high country. He was made of patience. I don't mean the tactical patience of a man waiting for the right moment in a negotiation. I mean the other kind. The kind that manifests as a willingness to sit at a table with a woman who's building her trust slowly and carefully, the way she does everything, and not push, not press, not apply any of the considerable force of personality you have at your disposal because you've learned, somewhere in the ruin of the last few months, that force is not always the right tool. I watched him not push. It was, honestly, one of the more remarkable things I'd seen in my life, and I'd seen Holt Sayer face down a federal land agent without blinking. He'd wait for her to bring things to him, a fence that needed an extra hand, a section of the ledger where his knowledge of market rates would be useful, a conversation that had found its level and was ready to go a little deeper. He'd wait for the invitation and then he'd show up fully and without making it a bigger thing than it was. And then he'd step back and give her the room again. I reckon she noticed, the way she noticed everything. The night that told me how things stood, not that I'd been uncertain, but the night that confirmed it in a way that didn't leave room for doubt, was the 15th of January, a Sunday. The temperature had dropped to the kind of number that made the station house creak and pop, and there was an ice fog out past the fence line that made the world look like it had been rubbed out and redrawn in gray. Clara had been at the stove since mid-afternoon, and the station house smelled of beef broth and rosemary and wood smoke, and when supper was on the table, it was the kind of supper that doesn't get made for a transaction. It gets made because someone is feeding people they want to see well fed. After supper, Clara went to the shelf and came back with a book, not the Bible, one of the other three, a slim volume I still couldn't read the spine of from my seat. She set it on the table and said, "I've been meaning to ask you something." Holt looked at her. "Roy's brother, I told you about him, the one who came with the offer to buy the station, he was here again in October, before you came." She paused. "He came with a different offer this time, a partnership arrangement. He'd put in capital against a 30% share of the station operation and bring his freight contacts in from the Laramie run." She opened the book to a page she'd marked with a slip of paper. "He's a capable man and his offer was fair, and I turned it down." "Why?" Holt said. She looked at the marked page, not at him. "Because the terms gave him a right of first refusal on any future sale, which meant he'd always have a hand on the door." She closed the book. "I've worked very hard to be the only person with a hand on this door." Holt was quiet. "I'm telling you this," she said, "because I want you to know that I understand what an arrangement means, what it costs, what it asks of a person." She looked at him now directly. "And I want you to know that I've revised my initial impression of the arrangement you and I made." "Revised it how?" he said. "I thought it was practical," she said. "I still think it was practical, but I think it may also be something else." Holt didn't say anything for a moment. The stove ticked. The ice fog was doing something to the light from the window, giving everything in the room a particular quality that I don't quite have the words for, something like the light just before it changes. "Clara," he said. He said her name the way a man says a word he's been careful with for a long time and is now deciding to use plainly. "I'm not in a hurry," she said. "I've been alone for 2 years and I know how to be alone. I'm not saying this out of any kind of need." "I know you're not," he said. "I'm saying it because I want to be honest about what I'm observing," she said, "because I find that I have a strong preference for honesty." "I've noticed that," Holt said. Something happened to her expression then, not the brief contained thing at the corner of her mouth, something fuller than that. Not quite a smile. Clara Voss's face wasn't built for the easy variety, but something warmer, something earned. "All right," she said, "then I'll put some more coffee on." That was all. I went out to check the horses, and I gave them a long and thorough check, and when I came back in there was fresh coffee on the table, and the two of them were talking about the spring freight rates on the Aldermere run, and I thought, well, that's how that happens then. Not with a speech, not with a grand gesture, with coffee put on and a long conversation about freight rates by a stove in a Wyoming winter. February was a different kind of month, still cold, still hard, but with a quality in the light by mid-morning that told you the year was thinking about turning even if it hadn't committed yet. The days got longer by minutes, then by something you could feel. The horses in the barn got restless in a particular way that meant spring in their blood even when the ground was still frozen. Holt started making plans. I want to say this carefully, because it would be easy to misread. He didn't make plans to leave. He made plans for the station. He got a letter to a man named Aldridge in Cheyenne who he'd done range business with for a decade, a good man with freight connections up the Laramie Run, and the letter was about rates and contract terms, and whether Aldridge had a line on any registered stock being moved in the spring. He got another letter to a man in Crofton who worked in property records, asking some careful questions about the Meridian Land Syndicate's local operations, and specifically about whether there were any legal vulnerabilities in the filings they'd made in the last 2 years. That second letter was the one I was most interested in. "You're going after the Meridian business," I said, one evening in the barn. Holt was oiling a harness strap. He didn't look up. "I'm gathering information." "Information about whether there's a legal route to the North Range." 9,000 acres, he said, doesn't disappear because a syndicate files paperwork. The paperwork has to be correct. Not all of it was. "I thought about this, and if you get it back." "Then I have a range," he said, "and a place to run cattle." He finished with the strap and set it down. "Clara's got 400 acres of decent grass, but she's never had the stock to work it properly. Roy Voss was a freight man, not a cattle man. She's been leaving value in that grass for 2 years. I looked at him. "That sounds like a business proposition." He looked back at me with the expression that had a ceiling on it. "Or more than that," I said. He picked up another harness strap. The Meridian information came back at the end of February, and it was what Holt had suspected. The syndicate's filing on his North Range had used a surveyor's assessment that had itself relied on a prior assessment that had been conducted in 1874, which was 5 years before Holt's operation had expanded to that range. The 1874 assessment had some significant errors in the parcel boundaries, the kind of errors that, if properly documented and submitted with a counterfiling, would put the original acquisition in serious legal question. It was not a certain thing. Nothing in the business of frontier land was certain, but it was enough to make the Meridian Syndicate's position on the North Range uncomfortable, and uncomfortable was a starting point. Holt wrote 3 letters in one evening and asked Clara to look over the language, which she did, suggesting 2 changes that tightened the argument considerably. He looked at her changes and said, "You should have been a lawyer." She looked at him over the letters. "I should have been a great many things," she said, and the way she said it had no bitterness in it, just the calm acknowledgement of a woman who'd spent 40 years being told what she should be and had long since decided what she actually was. "These are ready to send." He sent them in the morning. March came in on a wind that had something alive in it for the first time since November. The snow on the south-facing slopes was pulling back from the fence posts. The creek below the east draw was moving again under its ice cap, which you could hear if you stood near it in the morning quiet. The horses were restless in a way that was now about wanting to run and not about anything else. "I was thinking about the spring range," about what cattle work was going to look like, about whether the track to Aldermere was going to clear by the end of the month. I was also thinking, in the way I'd been thinking about it all winter in the background, about what was going to happen between Holt and Clara when the world opened up again and the practical pressure of the winter was off. I was not the only one thinking about it. I could tell, because Holt got quieter in the first week of March, a different kind of quiet than the winter silence, more deliberate, and Clara went back to working the ledger at supper time a couple of evenings in a row after weeks of leaving it alone until morning. They were both thinking about what it meant to step off the ice. The morning that resolved it was a Wednesday in the second week of March, gray and cold still, but with a quality to the air that meant something had shifted. Clara came out of the station house at first light with her coat on and walked down to the east draw fence line, which she did sometimes when she was thinking. I know because I'd seen her do it half a dozen times through the winter, and I'd learned it was the place where she went when she needed room. Holt came out of the barn 10 minutes later, and I was going to say something and then I didn't, because there are moments when a man keeps his own counsel and lets things unfold without his assistance. I watched him walk down to the east draw fence line. I couldn't hear what was said. I was too far back and the wind was wrong. But I watched, from the barn doorway, and I can tell you what I saw. I saw two people standing at a fence line in the gray March morning with the creek moving under the ice below them and the south slopes pulling back from the snow. I saw Clara Voss with her arms folded, which was her usual posture, and then I saw her arms come uncrossed, which was not. I saw Holt Sayer say something and then stand still in the way he stood still when what he'd said mattered, and he was waiting without pushing. I saw Clara look at the creek for a moment and then look at him. I saw her nod. It was a small thing, that nod. Not dramatic. Clara Voss was not a dramatic woman. It was the nod of a woman who has done the math carefully and arrived at a number she trusts and is ready to commit to it. I went back into the barn and let them have the rest of the morning without an audience. The legal situation with the Meridian Syndicate resolved itself in the first week of April, not entirely and not cleanly, but enough. The counterfiling threw a significant wrench into the syndicate's position on the North Range, and their lawyers, after 3 weeks of careful silence, came back with a proposal. A negotiated settlement that returned 6,000 of the 9,000 acres to Holt's control in exchange for a payment that was considerably less than the property's actual value, but considerably more than nothing. Holt took the settlement. He told me, the morning after he signed the papers in Crofton, that taking half a loaf when half a loaf is what you can get is not weakness, it's arithmetic. I thought that sounded a good deal like something Clara Voss would say, and I told him so, and he gave me the look that had the ceiling on it, but the ceiling was higher than usual. 6,000 acres of North Range, not the house which was still Meridian's and not the full operation, but range, grass, a place to put cattle. We rode back to the station with the papers and I put the horses up and gave them some extra feed because the news seemed to warrant it, and when I came in from the barn, Holt and Clara were at the table. And this time the ledger wasn't out. What was out was a piece of paper, and Holt was writing on it, and Clara was watching him write with her hands folded in that way she had, the way that looked like patience and was actually close attention. He pushed the paper toward her. I couldn't see what was on it from where I stood. I didn't need to. I know Holt Sayer, and I know that he is not a man for speeches. He is a man who reduces things to their essential bones and presents them plainly and waits for the answer without applying any pressure to it at all. Clara read it. She sat with it for a moment, the way she sat with any figure that needed thinking about. Then she looked up at him. "You put it in writing," she said. "You have a preference for precision," he said. She looked back at the paper. "This is precise," she said. "It's what I mean," he said, "every word of it." She read it once more, or appeared to. I think she'd read it the first time and understood it and was now deciding how to answer it, and the reading was just the time she gave herself to decide. She set the paper down. "Yes," she said. Simple as that. The way she did everything, with the directness of a woman who'd made up her mind and didn't need to dress the answer in anything extra. Yes, exactly that and no more. Holt Sayer, who I had seen face down federal agents and cattle barons and the Meridian Land Syndicate without the smallest change of expression, put his hand flat on the table and let out a breath. I went and got 3 coffee cups and I put them on the table and I said, "I'm going back to the barn after this," and Clara said, "No, you aren't, sit down," and I sat down and that was that. The wedding was in May, when the high country had finally made up its mind about spring, and the grass was coming in green on all 400 acres of the Voss Station Range, and on 6,000 acres of Holt Sayer's reclaimed North Range, which between them made something you could properly call an operation. The minister came out from Aldermere, a Swede named Eklund who was short and serious, and who had apparently married a considerable number of couples in the Wyoming high country, and had the practiced efficiency of a man who knew exactly how long the ceremony needed to be, and not 1 minute longer. There were perhaps 20 people at the station for it: Gustafson from the feed store, the Aldridge family from Cheyenne, a few of Clara's neighbors who I'd come to know over the winter, one old hand of Holt's from the pre-Meridian days who'd ridden 2 days to be there. I stood up for Holt. There was nobody else he was going to ask. Clara wore a dress I hadn't seen before, not a fancy dress, not the kind that implied she'd been waiting for an occasion, but a good gray wool dress with a white collar that was neat and just so and entirely her. She'd let her hair down for it, which I'd never seen before, and it changed her face in a way I found I couldn't quite describe and won't try. Holt wore his coat, the good charcoal wool one. It fit him right again, I noticed. Or maybe he fit it right again. It's hard to say where the coat ends and the man begins, after a while. Eklund performed the ceremony with the serious efficiency I'd expected. There was a moment near the end, when he asked the question and waited for the answers, and I watched Holt Sayer look at Clara Voss the way a man looks at something he wasn't sure he'd ever have again after the winter he'd had. And I looked at Clara Voss look back at him with the steady, direct attention of a woman who'd made her calculation and was entirely confident in the result. "I do," they each said, in their different ways and both of them meaning it completely. They built the cattle operation through the summer and fall, Holt running the range side, Clara running the books and the freight contracts with an efficiency that made Aldridge say, the first time he sat down with the numbers, that he wished he'd had her doing his accounts for the past 10 years. The arrangement with Aldridge on the Laramie freight run was renegotiated to terms that were considerably better than the rates Roy Voss had settled for, and the first full cattle drive off the North Range in October brought in a number that, Holt told me later, was the first time in 18 months he'd looked at a balance and felt something other than sick. I stayed on as segundo, which was the only role I knew and the one that suited me. The ranch that was taking shape, the Voss Sayer operation, though Clara kept the station name as Voss Station because it was hers, and she saw no reason to change what was working, was the kind of place that breeds a particular quality of loyalty in its hands. People who worked there stayed, and the ones who came usually came for good reasons. I am telling this story now from some years further along, and I want to close it by saying something about what I watched happen to Holt Sayer in that first winter at Voss Station. Because the closing of the empire, the Meridian business, the loss of the house and the range and the registered stock, I had expected that to break something in him. I had watched him walk up to that porch in December, and I had thought, that man is carrying the weight of a ruin, and I don't know if he's going to come out from under it. What I didn't account for was Clara Voss. Not because she fixed him. She would have been annoyed at that notion, and rightly so. She was not in the business of fixing men. She was in the business of running a tight operation, balancing a ledger and making sound decisions. And if those decisions happened to include, after careful analysis, the particular man standing at her kitchen table with a map in his hand and a roof problem she could solve, then that was a rational outcome. What she did, and I mean this with all the precision I can bring to it, was give him a table to sit at, in the full sense of that. A place where the ruin was not the main fact about him, where what was wanted was not the empire or the title or the fear he used to command, but just the man himself, with what he knew and what he was willing to do, and what he was willing to admit he didn't know. That turned out to be enough, more than enough. The last image I have, the one I carry when I think about that winter and what came out of it, a March morning at the East Draw fence line. Two people standing in the gray light before the spring had decided it was spring, with the creek moving under the ice below them. Clara's arms, which had been folded, coming uncrossed. Holt saying something and standing still afterward, not pushing, not pressing, just standing in the quiet waiting. And the nod. That small, precise, entirely Clara nod. I don't think I've ever seen a man go from ruin to solid ground in a single morning, but I saw something close to it that day. And the ground he stood on wasn't the North Range. That came later. It was a 400-acre station with a clean deed and a woman who ran a tight ledger, and a supper table at 6 that she cooked for 3. That was where he stood, and I think he knew, standing there at the fence line, that it was the best ground he'd ever had.